The recording lasted 4 seconds. That was what bothered senior analyst Varathsal more than anything else. Not the content, not the implications, but the duration. 4 seconds of audio captured by a passive relay buoy in the Kepler transit corridor, and then silence. The buoy itself had been found 3 weeks later, drifting without power, its hull abraded in a pattern that matched no known weapon system in the Dominion's catalogued arsenal. 4 seconds, a human voice, calm, almost gentle. Tell them we're ready. Ready for what? No one could say. The Dominion's translation matrices had processed the phrase 600 times. The syntax was unambiguous. The tone carried no detectable stress markers, and the transmission had been sent 11 minutes before the human defensive line at Kepler Station collapsed without a single shot fired in response. They had simply stopped fighting, laid down their weapons, sealed their airlocks, and waited. Varathsal stared at the waveform on his display and felt, for the first time in his 30-year analytical career, that he was looking at something he fundamentally did not understand. The Dominion's campaign against the human territories had lasted 19 months, which by any historical standard was embarrassingly long for a civilization of the Dominion's scale. The hegemony of aligned species comprised 41 member civilizations, commanded 11,000 warships, and had absorbed or dismantled 32 independent polities in the past 2 centuries without losing a single fleet engagement. The humans, by contrast, controlled 6 inhabited systems, fielded perhaps 900 registered warships, and had been spacefaring for less than 400 years. On paper, the conflict should have concluded in weeks. It's the shipyards, Fleet Commander Orath Vane had said at the initial briefing, displaying a holographic map of human space with the casual confidence of someone describing a solved problem. Their entire production capacity is concentrated. Seize the yards at Titan and Ceres, and they build nothing new. Their existing fleet becomes an attrition problem, not a strategic one. The assessment had been correct. Tactically, it had been almost insultingly correct. The Dominion had taken Titan in 6 days, Ceres in 11. The humans had fought, they always fought, but they had fought with the desperate, costly courage of people who already knew they were losing, which the Dominion's analysts had interpreted as confirmation that the strategy was working. Every human ship destroyed at those engagements was a ship that could not be replaced. The math was simple. Except that somewhere in the math, something had been missed. Varathsal had started to suspect it when the casualty projections stopped matching outcomes. The human fleet should have been down to perhaps 300 functional vessels by month 14. Instead, engagement logs were reporting contact with hull configurations that matched no registered design. When his team flagged this for review, the Fleet Command's response had been a form letter explaining that humans frequently modified their vessels in ways that made visual identification unreliable. He had accepted this. He was, after all, an analyst. His role was to interpret data, not to override the judgment of commanders with 11,000 warships at their disposal. Then came the 4-second recording. Then came the stillness at Kepler Station. Then came what the fleet reported as the unconditional surrender of Earth's remaining defense forces. And Varathsal, staring at a waveform that showed a calm human voice saying, "Tell them we're ready," found himself thinking about the hull configurations again, about the ships that matched no registered design, about what it meant that the humans had stopped fighting 11 minutes after that transmission, not 11 minutes before. "We've been reading the sequence wrong," he said aloud to no one. His office was empty. The words hung in recycled station air and meant nothing to anyone. The formal occupation of Earth began on what the humans called a Tuesday, which their calendar designated as the 14th day of the 3rd month of their year. The Dominion's ground forces, 12,000 soldiers drawn from 6 member species, descended on the major population centers with the practiced efficiency of an organization that had done this many times before. The humans did not resist. This was, according to every projection model the Dominion used, the expected outcome. Civilizations that lost their production capacity and their fleet superiority within a 14-month window universally entered what the models called a compliance cascade, a psychological and institutional collapse that expressed itself as submission. It was not weakness. The Dominion's civil administrators were careful to explain to new member species. It was rationality. The recognition that further resistance served no purpose. Commander Oreth Vane had declared the campaign complete. Varath Sal had filed a formal dissent, which had been acknowledged, catalogued, and ignored in that order. The occupation proceeded smoothly, almost unnervingly so. The human administrative apparatus cooperated with the installation of Dominion oversight structures. Their remaining military personnel reported for disarmament as directed. The civilian population, 7 billion people distributed across a single planet and 2 colony habitats, went about their daily lives with what the occupation's sociological monitors described as low-aggression compliance indicators. A colonel in the ground forces named Daranash sent a private message to Varath Sal 4 weeks into the occupation, because they had trained together a decade earlier and occasionally still spoke. "Something is wrong," Daranash wrote. "I cannot explain it. The humans cooperate. They answer questions. They submit to every inspection without complaint, and yet I cannot shake the feeling that they are waiting." Waiting for what? Varath Sal had written back. The reply had come 6 hours later. "That's the problem. I've asked 3 of them directly. All 3 smiled. Not the same kind of smile, different people, different circumstances, different ages, but they all smiled the same way, like they knew something I don't." Varath Sal read the message 3 times and then saved it to a personal archive that he had begun, almost unconsciously, in the weeks following the Kepler station recordings. He did not know what the archive was for. He told himself he was being thorough. He told himself that was what analysts did. He didn't believe himself. The first documented misinterpretation occurred in month 2 of the occupation, and it concerned food. The human workers assigned to support the Dominion's administrative center in what they called Washington were observed sharing meals with the soldiers stationed there. This was flagged by a monitoring officer as a potential attempt at cultural infiltration, a tactic used by several previously absorbed civilizations to establish informal relationship networks that could later be leveraged against occupation personnel. The monitoring officer filed a formal report. The sharing of meals was prohibited. The humans nodded and complied. 2 weeks later, the monitoring officer, a young logistics specialist named Varath, developed what the medical staff diagnosed as a nutrition deficiency syndrome. A secondary review revealed that 17 other Dominion personnel in the administrative center had developed similar symptoms. Investigation determined that the local food supplies the Dominion had been consuming were subtly incompatible with non-human biology. The humans had known this. They had been sharing their asterisk food, which they had sourced and prepared themselves, specifically because they had recognized the compatibility problem and were, in their way, trying to help. The monitoring officer was embarrassed. The report was quietly revised. Command issued new dietary guidelines and moved on. Varath Sal added the incident to his archive and noted the piece that bothered him most. The humans had not said anything. They had simply shared meals. When the sharing was prohibited, they had not explained, had not protested, had not said, "We're doing this because your food will make you sick." They had nodded and complied. And 17 people had gotten sick. Had the humans been cruel? Had they been helping and simply stopped helping when told to? Had they expected the Dominion to figure it out? Or had they, on some level, known exactly what would happen and decided to let it run its course? He did not know. He was not sure the question had a clean answer. He filed a request for a xenopsychology review of human behavioral patterns in occupied contexts. The request was denied. The campaign was complete. Resources were being reallocated. In month 3, the Dominion completed its full assessment of the captured shipyards. The Titan facilities were extensive, easily the largest construction infrastructure humanity had built in the outer solar system, capable of producing vessels up to cruiser class, with dry dock capacity for approximately 40 ships simultaneously. Ceres was smaller but more densely equipped, its fabrication systems more automated than anything the Dominion's engineers had expected from a civilization of Earth's technological age. The assessment team's lead engineer, a specialist named Orith Dune, sent a summary to Fleet Command that was simultaneously confident and puzzling. "Facilities are intact and operational," the summary read. "We can convert them to Dominion production standards within 8 months. However, we note a discrepancy in the throughput records. Based on the equipment installed and the power consumption logs from the past 6 years, these facilities should have produced between 1,100 and 1,300 vessels. Registered hull counts in human fleet records account for approximately 900. The difference, 200 to 400 vessels, is unaccounted for." Fleet Command's response was characteristically brief. "Assume attrition losses in earlier engagements. Proceed with conversion." Orith Dune had complied, because that was what engineers did when Fleet Command told them to proceed. Verath Sol had obtained a copy of the summary through professional channels and had read it 4 times before he noticed that his hands were slightly unsteady. 200 to 400 vessels, unaccounted for. He opened his archive. He started cross-referencing the hull configurations that had appeared during months 10 through 14, the ships that matched no registered design. He had 47 recorded sightings. He had treated them as modification anomalies. He stopped treating them as modification anomalies. He pulled every passive sensor log from the outer system relays, from the deep monitoring stations, from the buoy networks that the Dominion had largely ignored because they had been focused on the inner system where the fighting was. He spent 9 hours processing data that no one had asked him to process. When he was done, he sat very still for a long time. The unregistered vessels hadn't been destroyed in battle. They hadn't been hidden in human fleet records. They hadn't been modifications or misidentifications. They had been asterisk built in a different place entirely. "I need to speak with Commander Oreth Vane." The aide on the other end of the channel did not look up from her secondary display. "The commander is not accepting non-operational communications." "This is operational." "Your classification is Senior Analyst, Mr. Verath Sol. Analyses are reviewed through the—" "Tell him," Verath Sol said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, "that I know where the rest of the human fleet is." A pause. The aide looked up. 30 minutes later, he was standing in the commander's operational center, a room large enough to make a person feel appropriately small, surrounded by the kind of people who had stopped the war 19 months ago and believed it. He put his data on the display. "These are the human shipyards we captured," he said, pointing. "Titan, Ceres, combined production capacity approximately 900 vessels over the program's operational lifespan. We have accounted for 900 vessels." He moved to the secondary overlay. "These are passive sensor readings from the outer system over the past 4 years, specifically from the Kuiper Belt, from beyond Neptune, from locations that our survey teams classified as uninhabited and strategically irrelevant." The room was quiet. "There are thermal signatures consistent with large-scale industrial activity at 43 separate locations," Verath Sol said. "Power consumption profiles that match fabrication-grade energy output. The signatures are subtle individually. Each one would read as background noise. Collectively," he took a breath, Collectively, they represent a construction program that dwarfs what we found at Titan and Ceres by a factor of approximately 3. Orathvane's voice was very careful when he spoke. You're saying the humans built a second shipyard network. Not a network, Varathsal said. That's the word I kept reaching for, and it's wrong. A network implies coordination between facilities with some kind of administrative center. What I'm looking at is, he struggled for the right framing. The humans didn't build a second fleet. They built the capacity to build a second fleet, and then they hid it, and then they fought us in the inner system with their registered vessels while the outer program continued operating. Every month we spent pushing toward Earth, they were building. The room was still very quiet. How many vessels? Orathvane asked. I can't give you a precise count. The thermal signatures suggest, he paused, between 800 and 1,200 additional hulls. The commander's expression did not change. That was, Varathsal thought, perhaps the most frightening thing he had ever seen. A face that could absorb a number like that without moving. And the surrender, Orathvane said finally, at Kepler Station, was not a surrender, Varathsal said. I believe it was a ceasefire, a deliberate pause, purchased by giving us exactly what we expected to see: a broken fleet, damaged shipyards, a civilization that had run out of options. We walked into Earth space believing we had won. We installed an occupation government. We are, at this moment, cataloging facilities and conducting civil administration while outside this system. In the dark and cold of their outer planets, humanity has been building ships for 19 months without any interference whatsoever. Tell them we're ready, Orathvane said quietly. The words from the 4-second recording, Varathsal nodded. That transmission was not sent to another human, he said. Based on my reconstruction of the relay geometry, it was sent *inward, toward Earth, toward the occupation zone. It was not a communication to the fleet outside. It was a confirmation to someone inside that the outer construction program had reached a specified threshold. He watched the commander understand. They were telling their own people that it was time to stop fighting, Orathvane said. Not because they were beaten. Because they were finished, Varathsal said. The Dominion's response was swift by institutional standards and catastrophically slow by any meaningful measure. 3 fleets were recalled from extended patrol assignments. 12 additional vessels were rerouted from the hegemony's core territory. Emergency, strategic reviews were called by representatives of 6 member species who had, until 72 hours ago, considered the human conflict a closed matter. None of this was fast enough, and on some level, Varathsal suspected they all knew it. But civilizations facing the reinterpretation of a fundamental assumption do not respond with speed. They respond with the careful, deliberate processes of organizations that have not had to move quickly in a very long time. Meanwhile, Daranash was still on Earth. Tell me what you're seeing, Varathsal calmed him, bypassing the formal reporting chain in a way that would have consequences later and which he did not care about. The smiling, Daranash said. His voice had changed in the months since his first message. Thinner, more careful. It's gotten quieter. The humans in the civilian sectors, they've stopped being conversational with our soldiers. They're polite, but they're present the way people are present when they're waiting for a train. Not engaged, just marking time. How many of your people have noticed? Most of them haven't, or they've noticed and interpreted it as compliance fatigue. Occupied populations grow quieter over time. It's in the standard behavioral models. My commanding officer told me to stop flagging it. A pause. She's not wrong that it matches the models. The problem is I don't think the humans read the models. What do you mean? I mean I think they're performing compliance fatigue. Not as a deception, not consciously maybe, but they know what a beaten population looks like, and they're giving us one. They're so good at it that my commander sees textbook occupation dynamics and stops looking. His voice dropped. I found one of the human administrative liaisons this morning. The one who's been helping us with municipal records. He was sitting in a stairwell eating lunch by himself. I asked him how he was doing. What did he say? He said, honestly, I'm tired of pretending to be sad about this. Daranash exhaled. And then he looked at me like he'd said something he shouldn't have, and he finished his lunch, and he went back to being very cooperative and slightly defeated. A long pause. Varath Sal, what did he mean? I think, Varath Sal said, that 19 months of deliberate surrender is a very long time to maintain a performance, and I think some of them are getting tired of waiting. The silence on the channel lasted 5 full seconds. How fast can reinforcements reach us? Daranash asked. Not fast enough, Varath Sal said, and he meant it in ways he didn't yet have words for. The ships came from the dark. Not all at once, which would have at least had the narrative clarity of a dramatic entrance. They came across a period of 11 hours, emerging from the outer system in groups of 12 to 20, following trajectories that the Dominion's tracking systems, optimized for the inner system, pointed inward, positioned to defend against what had already been captured, were not well designed to detect. The first Dominion officer to identify what was happening was a sensor technician aboard the resurgent Claim Asterisk, a frigate stationed at the edge of Earth's orbital zone. She was 19 years old by her species reckoning, had been in service for 8 months, and would later report that she had initially classified the contacts as debris clusters before running a second algorithmic pass. I have drive signatures, she told her superior, her voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who was working very hard not to sound like they were panicking. Multiple contacts, outer bearing. Class profiles are, she paused. Sir, I don't have classifications for these hull types. Her superior looked at the display. He looked at it for a long time. How many? He asked. Currently tracking 41 distinct groups. She swallowed. Sir, if they're maintaining group cohesion at this bearing spread, the total contact count is. She stopped. Say it, he said. I'm tracking over 900 vessels, sir, and the outer array is still reporting new contacts. The Dominion forces in the inner system numbered 208 warships. 800 of its soldiers were on Earth's surface. 12,000 were distributed across the occupation zones supporting infrastructure. The human fleet that materialized across the approach corridor over the following hours numbered, by final count, 1,063 vessels. None of them matched designs in the Dominion's registered catalog. All of them had been built in the cold dark of the outer solar system during the 19 months the Dominion had spent believing the war was over. The ships did not open fire. They stopped, at a distance that was precisely calculated, far enough to make the Dominion's firing solutions mathematically uncertain, close enough to make the implication unmistakable. They settled into position like something that had always been there, waiting to be revealed. And then a human voice came across the command channel, not urgent, not triumphant, the same quality as the 4-second recording, calm, almost gentle. This is Admiral Yusuf Kamara, commanding the 2nd Fleet of the Earth Defense Compact. To the commander of Dominion forces in the Sol system, I have a proposal. Orath Vane, from his operational center, took exactly 6 seconds before responding. Admiral, he said. You have 208 warships, Kamara said. We have counted them carefully. We have 800 of your soldiers on our planet and we have treated them well. I want you to know that, and I want you to verify it independently because it matters for what I'm about to say. Your ground forces are unharmed. Your occupation personnel are unharmed. In 19 months, we have not sabotaged, attacked, or deliberately inconvenienced a single Dominion soldier on our soil. You surrendered, Orath Vane said, and Varath Sal, listening from a secondary terminal, heard the commander's tone shift in a way it never had before. A question hidden in a statement. A man who was realizing he did not understand the ground he was standing on. We paused, Kamara said, There's a difference. We paused because we needed time, and the most efficient way to buy time was to give you exactly what you expected. A broken civilization, a compliant population, a captured shipyard. He paused. You did capture our shipyards, that's real. We've known for 6 years that you were coming, and we knew we couldn't hold them indefinitely, so we made a decision. We were going to give you the ships we'd already built, let you count them, let you feel like the accounting balanced, and build the real fleet somewhere you weren't looking. The outer system, Oreth Vane said. We started construction 27 months before you arrived. The facilities are in places your survey teams dismissed as geologically inactive and strategically irrelevant, which was accurate as far as that goes. We built them cold, minimal heat signature, distributed power, no centralized emission profile. Every individual site looked like background noise. We were counting on the fact that you had 41 member civilizations and 11,000 warships, which meant your analysts were probably not spending a lot of time personally reviewing passive deep system sensor data from a civilization you outgunned by a factor of 12. In the silence that followed, Varathsal thought about his 9 hours of data review, about the 37 formal requests for review that had preceded it, each denied. What is your proposal, Admiral? Oreth Vane asked. Your soldiers go home, Kamara said. Every one of them. Unharmed on their own ships, escorted to the transit corridor by 2 of our vessels so they know they're safe. In exchange, the Dominion opens formal negotiations on a relationship of mutual non-interference. We are not asking to join the hegemony. We are asking to be left alone. And if we decline? The channel was quiet for 3 seconds. Then we have a different kind of conversation, Kamara said. But I want to be honest with you, Commander. Your soldiers have been on our planet for 19 months. We know their names. We know which ones are fair and which ones are frightened, and which ones were kind to our children on the street. We fed them when their food was making them sick. We helped them navigate a city that doesn't make sense to someone who didn't grow up in it. We have not wanted a war with them. We have wanted them to go home. That's all we've ever wanted. His voice stayed even. But we also built 1,000 ships in the dark while your civilization was counting the ones you'd taken. That's the thing you need to understand about us. Both of those things are true at the same time. Daranash received the ceasefire notification on a personal communicator rather than a command channel, because the command channel was occupied with the logistics of extraction. He was standing on the steps of the administrative building he had occupied for the past 7 months, watching the first transports arrive. The human liaison who had eaten lunch in the stairwell was standing 10 meters away, watching with him. You knew, Daranash said. I suspected. The man, his name was Tamaz, Daranash had learned eventually, shrugged. The people who actually knew didn't tell people like me the specific numbers. It was safer not to. You can't accidentally reveal what you don't know. But you knew something was coming. We were told to be patient. Tamaz glanced at him sideways. It's interesting, actually. The hardest part wasn't the occupation itself. The hardest part was watching you start to feel comfortable, watching you file reports, hold meetings, adjust to the time zone, learn which food stalls were open late. He paused. You were starting to settle in. And we had to keep being patient while you settled in. Some people found that harder than others. Daranash thought about the 17 people who had gotten sick from incompatible food. About the months of smiles he hadn't understood. When your people prohibited the shared meals, he said, you knew we'd get sick. Tamaz was quiet for a moment. We knew it was a possibility. And you let it happen. We stopped bringing food because we were told to stop. We're very good at following instructions. A pause that lasted long enough to mean something. We're also very good at not explaining things that weren't asked about. Daranash looked at him for a long time. Was that cruelty or patience? Honestly, Tamaz smiled, and it was that same smile, the one from the early days, the one Daranash had never been able to interpret. I'm not sure there's a clean answer to that. 19 months of something that felt like losing is a long time. People find ways to feel like they're still in it. He looked at the transports. No one was seriously hurt. That mattered to us. That line mattered. But there was a line, Daranash said. There's always a line. Tamaz tilted his head. You thought we didn't have one because we let you in. That was the misunderstanding. We didn't let you in. We opened the door ourselves because we decided that was the fastest way to get to the ending we wanted. He glanced at the transport again. We're glad you're going home. I mean that. Daranash believed him. That was perhaps the most disorienting part, that the sincerity and the calculation had existed together, without contradiction, in the same people for 19 months. Your admiral, Daranash said. The one on the channel, did he know from the beginning how it would end? He knew how he wanted it to end. Whether the numbers would be right, whether the timing would hold, whether the construction program would complete before the occupation became something that couldn't be walked back. Tamaz shook his head. No one knew that. You're asking if we had certainty. We didn't have certainty. We had a plan and enough people willing to hold it together long enough for the plan to have a chance. The first transport lifted, carrying the initial rotation of Dominion soldiers toward orbit. What if it hadn't worked? Daranash asked. What if we'd found the outer yards? What if the numbers had been wrong? Tamaz looked at the sky for a while before answering. Then we would have thought of something else, he said. That's not bravado, that's how we work. You stop one thing, we think of something else. You close one door, we find a wall that we can take apart from the inside. We've been that way as long as we've been a species. He glanced at Daranash, and there was something in the look that wasn't unkind but wasn't quite comfortable either. I think that's what you didn't account for, not the ships. The ships are just metal. It's the part of us that builds ships in the dark for 2 years, and then smiles at the people who took our shipyards and asks how their food is going down. He straightened, looked once more at the transport, and then turned toward the building. Safe travels, Daranash, he said. I mean that too. Varath Sal wrote his final report from the orbital station as the last Dominion ships departed the Sol system. He wrote it carefully, methodically, in the style his career had trained him to use: factual, sourced, dispassionate. He failed the dispassionate part near the end. He wrote about the 4-second transmission. He wrote about the outer system thermal signatures. He wrote about the food and the smiling and the 19 months of performed defeat. He wrote about Tamaz, whom he had never met but whose words Daranash had relayed to him with the precision of someone who wanted them preserved exactly. He wrote about the 1,063 ships that had materialized from the dark, that had stopped at precisely calculated range, that had not fired a single shot. He wrote, "We have characterized this civilization as rational, cooperative, and militarily outmatched. 2 of these 3 characterizations were deliberate presentations. The third was not wrong. Humanity was militarily outmatched in the inner system with their registered fleet. The error was the assumption that the inner system fleet represented their full commitment to the conflict. It did not represent their full commitment. It represented the portion they were willing to lose." He paused, wrote, "The portion they were willing to lose." He sat with that sentence for a long time. He thought about a civilization that had spent 6 years knowing an invasion was coming, that had built visible shipyards and a visible fleet and conducted a visible defense, and lost, and surrendered, and smiled at its occupiers for 19 months while the real project continued in the cold and the dark where no one was looking. That had fed its occupiers' soldiers out of genuine care for their well-being, while simultaneously watching them suffer symptoms that might have been avoided with a single explanation. Because explaining would have required a kind of engagement they had collectively decided not to offer until the time was right. Both things at once, the care and the calculation, without contradiction. He thought about Tamaz saying, "You stop one thing, we think of something else." He thought about what it meant that humanity's advantage had not been the ships, had not been the construction program, or the misdirection, or the outer system facilities. The advantage had been that they had looked at a civilization with 11,000 warships and 41 member species, and a 200-year track record of absorbing every polity it had ever encountered, and they had decided, apparently without much internal debate, that they were going to win. Not that they might win. Not that they would fight until they couldn't. That they were going to win, and then they had reorganized their entire civilization around that decision and held it together for 6 years. He thought about the specific kind of species that could do that. The report's final paragraph went through 11 drafts. The first 10 were analytical. The 11th was not. He wrote, "The Dominion has, throughout its history, absorbed civilizations that resisted until they could not. We have no established framework for a civilization that chose, strategically, when to appear defeated, that treated occupation as a logistical phase rather than a terminal state, that never, at any point in 19 months of foreign governance, actually stopped. We have records of species that fought to the end. We have records of species that surrendered and accepted the outcome. We do not have records, prior to this engagement, of a species that surrendered as a technique. I do not know how to classify humanity within our existing models. I do not believe our existing models are the right tool. What I can say with confidence is this: we believed the war was over because the humans stopped shooting. We should have asked why they stopped shooting. The answer, that they had finished what they needed to build and no longer required the cover that combat provided, was available in the data. We did not look, because we had already decided the question was answered. The humans knew we would do this. They built their entire strategy around the certainty that we would see a surrendered fleet and call it a conclusion. They were correct. They are not the most powerful species we have encountered. They are not the most technologically sophisticated. They are not, by any metric we track, the most formidable in direct confrontation. They are, however, the only species we have encountered that appears constitutionally incapable of believing a situation is final. Every rational civilization we have absorbed reached a point where the calculus of resistance became negative and adjusted accordingly. Humanity reached that same point and kept a second set of books. I recommend we do not encounter them again under adversarial conditions, not because they would certainly win, but because I no longer know what winning would mean to them, or how long they would be willing to wait to find out." He submitted the report. He stared at the Sol system on his display for a while, watching the last Dominion transit signatures fade toward the jump corridor. Somewhere below, on a blue-white planet that had spent 19 months performing its own defeat, 7 billion people were watching the same thing from the other direction. He thought about that liaison eating lunch in a stairwell, tired of pretending to be sad about it, almost letting something slip. He thought about the smile. He thought about what it meant that they had never, in all of it, not in the food, not in the surrender, not in the 19 months of careful, patient performance, what it meant that they had never looked afraid. Not because they weren't, but because they had decided, somewhere before the beginning of any of this, that fear was not the thing that got to make the decisions. The display dimmed. The transit signatures vanished. The Sol system sat in the dark, unremarkable, a yellow star with a scattering of orbiting rocks, and somewhere in the cold beyond the last visible planet, 43 sites of industrial activity that were already, Varath Sol suspected, building something new. He did not know what. He suspected the humans didn't entirely know yet either. He suspected that had never stopped them before, and would not stop them now, and that this was the thing about them that no report he had ever read, and no model the Dominion used, and no framework built from 2 centuries of absorbing the civilizations of a galaxy, would ever quite manage to hold in its hands long enough to study. You could take their shipyards. You could count their ships. You could occupy their planet and catalog their infrastructure, and watch their people smile at you from stairwells. And somewhere in the dark, in the cold, in the patient, unremarkable silence of a species that had never once believed the situation was final,